We're joined by International Relations Analyst Aaliyah Vayez for a discussion on the first anniversary of the Hamas attacks on Israel that fell on October 7th. This event sparked a year-long conflict between Israel and Gaza that has caused hundreds of casualties, mostly in Gaza, and divided opinion around the world. Aaliyah, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. Just listening in to what former DIRCO Minister Naledi Pandor had to say about some powerful countries who need to essentially intervene to stop genocide. In fact, as you and I speak, I've just seen that Bolivia has joined South Africa's ICJ genocide case against Israel, just really speaking to how many countries are now looking to join this and stop what's happening in Israel. This is a war, of course, we know, that has left most of the territory in ruins and shattered the lives of its people. What's your reflection?
I think that's a great starting point, Paul, and thank you so much for having me this evening. I think on the immediate front, we've seen over 42,000 casualties in the Gaza Strip. It's a wasteland of absolute infrastructure destruction. We've seen death, disease, poor hygiene, the largest humanitarian crisis the region has seen, let alone the world. And I think, on the side of this, we've also got ongoing violence, which can, largely constitute as terrorism across the West Bank, where, at least 5 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli occupation forces today. So I think we are nowhere near, seeing any kind of de-escalation as much as we heard in your news segment, our ministers call for across the international landscape. I think, as you mentioned, the comment by Naledi Pandor, I wholly agree with. I think there's been far too much navel gazing from Western countries like the US, like the UK, on what they can and cannot do to help or aid the situation in any way, whether that's militarily or diplomatically. I think, the common question is, what can you as a country do? And I think by virtue of being an international actor, you have leverage in the situation to use, either whether it's diplomatically calling for a permanent ceasefire or, diplomatically aiding the peace process or negotiation process, or whether it is, if you are a Western nation, de-escalating your supply of military arms, which I know countries like the UK, or groups rather in the UK, are calling for non-stop. I think this is a powerful moment of reflection to state that, the events of October 7th, and, I wouldn't discount the kind of retaliation from Hamas and Palestinian forces against Israel. But number one, it is wholly an unfair comparison, because as we've seen over the past year, Gazans and Palestinians have suffered, immeasurably in comparison to Israel, which I acknowledge the hostages are still not free. However, I think this is an important time to note that October 7th was not a culmination of events. It was a manifestation. We have been on the precipice of a conflict like this for decades.
You speak about how South Africa has some sort of leverage with the ICJ genocide case against Israel. But how then do we begin to assess the impact of that leverage with this case? More so, as we know that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected the ICJ's interim ruling as outrageous, saying that Israel is going to continue anyway.
100%, and I think the ICJ case is not only an example of international solidarity from largely countries in the global south. We've seen, yes, Bolivia has most recently joined a group of countries that have shown their support to South Africa in the ICJ by, entering as parties on the case, that are willing to intervene in the court's proceedings. But I think there's a broader question, which I think you've well alluded to, Paul, is that international institutions that uphold humanitarian law, human rights, and legal principles are being wholly discredited right now. How can a country that is a party, to the international system essentially discredit its ruling? Its ruling by which every other country in the world is supposed to and has signed up to abide by. That ruling that the ICJ gave in January said Israel must do everything in its power to prevent a genocide, and that is not what we're seeing, as you pointed out, Paul. So I think countries like South Africa, yes, it was a bold move by Bolivia and should be applauded, but more and more countries must be seen to be stepping up in this sort of way, not necessarily through the ICJ, but through their diplomatic or regional channels, economically, militarily. Countries like Israel, essentially the call is to isolate them in order for them to listen, because clearly international institutions are not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Aaliyah, as I looked through some of the visuals of marking the anniversary and looking at some of the videos that are showing on various platforms, I saw a banner which read "Deal equals surrender." And that to me was a reminder perhaps of how deeply divided at this point Israelis have become over how to proceed in what is now the country's largest war since 1948.
I think you're right. I think on both sides of the kind of population, both the Israelis as well as the Palestinians, it's not only divided, but it's deeply mistrustful of any kind of peace process or ceasefire negotiation process because of the fragility of the conflict or the ongoing genocide. And simply the number of times that this scenario has broken down. We've seen peace proposals being put forth by former Israeli Prime Minister and Yasser Arafat, as well as the foreign ministers of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and we simply can't get parties to come to the table and agree on. And I think a fundamental linchpin of the reason why that has occurred is because the Israeli security dilemma of facing regional security threats from all sides, essentially, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Iran and its nuclear program, whether it is what's currently unfolding in Lebanon, must be addressed. Both sides need to be not only made to feel secure and safe in whatever the outcome needs to be, but they need to be heard on a somewhat equal platform, which unfortunately does not exist for Palestinians at all. So I think it is potentially premature to be talking about any kind of two-state solution when parties haven't gotten to the table yet. But I don't discredit any diplomatic or regional efforts to remedy the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for weighing in on this discussion and speaking to us this evening. That was International Relations Analyst Aaliyah Vayez giving us some insight there as we reflect on the conflict between Israel and Gaza.